Welcome, bienvenue, a bunch of other foreign language things to say. Hey, how you doing? I am Jamie Beckett, AOPA's Foundation's You Can Fly Ambassador for the East Coast. That other guy, Pat Brown, the AOPA You Can Fly Ambassador for the Central United States. Yes, I'm wearing a cowboy hat in honor of my good friend Pat Brown and the great state of Texas, but because there's an ulterior motive. There's something big coming in 2023. AOPA is going to participate in the Buckeye, Arizona fly-in, Pat, and I'm going all the way from Florida way out to Arizona. We're going to be doing, I think, 5 different live presentations there. I would go just for that. I think it's worth it. What do you think?
Oh man, it sounds like so much fun. Sounds like so much fun. You're wearing a cowboy hat. And is there any such thing as a Florida hat? I don't know.
I think baseball cap pretty much does it for us.
Well,
Although,
you covered then.
you know, Texas is #1 in cattle. Florida is actually #2 in the United States in cattle. So there are a lot of cowboys here. It's just we don't look as cool. We're more flip flops and shorts. You know. So. Hey, Danny Carson's on right from the start. I like that. Hey, Danny, nice to see you. I'm very excited and sad to say this is the last Ask an Ambassador for 2022. We're going to give you a break for the 27th because Christmas week, you probably got stuff to do with your family, but we will be back on, January 10th, Pat? I think January 10th we'll be back with a whole new slew of programming for 2023. It's going to be a great year, but 2022 really was great. We were back from COVID and doing live things again, having the STEM Symposium in Memphis. We had Sun and Fun. We had AirVenture. You went to some of that stuff. I went to some of that stuff. The audience might have gone to some of that stuff. It was a good year, don't you think?
Yeah, mucho fun, mucho fun.
Well, tonight, I think we're compelled to do this big grab bag full of opportunity and just talk about what's the deal with upgrades? Because, you know, most of us get into flying a PA-28 or a Cessna 150, 152, 172, planes that we might not think of as the most exciting things, although I have an awful lot of fun in those airplanes. But, you know, there's a whole menu of opportunities to add on to your certificate and do all sorts of things, maybe that you didn't even think of when you got into flying. Pat and I have both been lucky enough to delve into some of that over our career. So I think we should talk about it, Pat. How we get into it, why we get into it, what's it going to cost, and, you know, what's the benefit? Those are all valid questions, don't you think?
Oh, yeah. I'm ready when you are. Let's jump in with both feet.
Okay, and we got Antonio. What's that?
Hold on to your cowboy hat. Let's jump in.
It's glued on real good. You know, it's covering up the hair transplant. So when I come back next year, it'll be a whole new look. You'll be astounded. But Pat, give me one good reason to pursue an upgrade. I mean, an add-on of some sort. And there's so many opportunities. But for yourself, when you started doing this, because you've got several, as I have, what's one reason that you said, you know what, I'm going to go do some more training and I'm going to get this endorsement or this rating or whatever it was that appealed to you?
Well, when I got my tail wheel endorsement, the motivating factor there was I wanted to build some time and I wanted to do it as inexpensively as possible. And we have a glider club here in town that I'm a member of, and they needed tow pilots, and they fly. At the time I was flying with them, they were flying a Pawnee and a Cessna Ag Wagon. Now we've since gone to nothing but Ag Wagons, but those are both tailwheel airplanes. And so this was the motivating factor, besides the fact it was fun, was I wanted to build a bunch of time. And 2,300 glider tows later, and I don't know how many takeoffs, actually, I don't know how many hours of flying those things. And it was just great fun. And then I got my seaplane rating several years ago. And that one was just purely because I just wanted to have the seaplane rating. There you go. And have a chance to go fly off the water. And I got to tell you, I thought getting my glider certificate was fun. I thought getting my tailwheel endorsement was fun. But when I started flying seaplanes, oh man, it was just a whole new world. In fact, I got to use that rating about 3 years ago, my wife and I went up to Alaska for about a week and a half of just self-guided fun. And one day we actually went out and rented a seaplane with a guide, and we flew all over the Sound down there in Anchorage. Just, I'm telling you what, the scenery was just breathtaking. So, if I had to summarize all of that nonsense I just said down into one word, it would be fun.
I like it. And yeah, I agree with you. I think it is an awful lot of fun. My first add-on actually was after I got my private and my instrument, I got a multi-private. And we were talking about this earlier. The whole reason was because now that I'm multi-rated, I could log multi-PIC time while I was on my way to getting a multi-commercial later on. But you're absolutely right. It's just fun. And I mean, if you really want to do this, and by this, I mean fly, we've got such a wide spectrum of things we can do, places we can go, experiences we can have. Let's talk about the glider thing. And I'll be upfront. I really have thought about adding a glider rating to my certificate. I have not yet done it. I've been up to the glider port a few times. I've really considered it. But because of COVID and instructors not being available, it just never worked out. What was the experience like for you, Pat? I mean, when you added on that glider, you're not going and studying for a knowledge test and doing 40 hours like you did to do your private, is it? It's a whole different thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I went straight to the commercial glider because I had my commercial power certificate. So I went straight to the commercial glider. And I mean, if you look at the regs, I mean, there's specific things you have to do. You have 20 flights and some other things. It's been so long since I had to go back and look and see exactly what it was, but it wasn't onerous at all. There's no written test if you're going to from a power to glider, no written test. It is a check ride. It is an actual check ride with an examiner, and there will be an oral. The oral is going to focus a great deal on really the differences in flying those two types of craft. Obviously, when you're flying glider, you're kind of subject to the whims of Mother Nature in terms of lift or thermal lift or orographic lift, ridge lift, that kind of stuff, or sink, which is the opposite of lift. If you're let's say down here in the flatlands where we are, most of what we get is just thermal lift. The sun heats the ground heats the surrounding air, hot air rises, you catch the thermal and you go up. Well, hot air goes up, it cools, and it comes back down again in the form of sink, S-I-N-K. So a lot of the oral is based around towing techniques and the strength of the tow rope and the braking strength of the tow rope and the hooks and the weather phenomena that you have to deal with, kind of reading the clouds and things like that. There's a cross-country element to it because unlike flying a powered airplane, you don't just hit direct enter on the GPS, follow a magenta line. You have to calculate safety circles around each of your waypoints or your turn points. And so the difference going from point A to point B isn't necessarily a straight line. It could be a very zigzaggy line, for example. So, but the check ride is pretty straightforward. I'll tell you what, that's one of my students. After I got my CFI for gliders, that's one of my students. Just after he soloed, as a matter of fact, before we dumped the water on his head when he got out of the airplane. It's a pretty straightforward check ride. There's nothing really difficult about it. It really does teach you about what those things on the floor are. When you've got a 50-foot wingspan, adverse yaw is a thing. I mean, it's a real thing. So it teaches you about what those rudder pedals are down there too. So it's great fun. And when you cut from the tow plane and you're up there by yourself and or with another person and really you can talk in a normal voice, and you can literally soar with the hawks and the sparrows and the eagles and whatever else might be up there. And that's actually quite a fun thing to do, is chase them around the skies. They can outmaneuver you like crazy, but it sure is fun to chase them around the sky.
Oh, great. Yeah. And one of the great things about it, whatever add-on you choose for, whether it's just an endorsement or it's a new rating, it kind of gets you back into studying. And I assume with gliders, you really start thinking about power management and inertia and that sort of thing. And it's really good as a pilot periodically to delve into some kind of educational thing, because it just gets you, in some sense, it gets you back to the basics where you're looking at airspace and that sort of thing and V speeds. At some point, it just opens up a whole new variety of experiences you could have. So it inspires you, motivates you to go ahead and really study again. And, if you're going to study, you're going to get better. You're going to understand more. And I got to admit, I don't think you can add anything without learning something that's applicable to everything else you fly.
That it's interesting that you should say that, though, because in glider world, there's something called a polar, 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 and it's in its very basic sense, it's nothing much more than different than a drag curve. But we don't talk about it in terms of a drag curve. Let's say in gliders, it's more about determining your minimum sink and your best glide speeds, and then taking into account, are you flying into a headwind or are you flying a tailwind, to figure out what speed might be appropriate for any given condition. And typically the conventional wisdom is slow down and lift, speed up and sink. You want to stay in the lift for as long as you can. You want to get out of the sink as quick as you can. But the polar can kind of help you figure out what the appropriate speeds are for that. So it's nothing that's complicated. It's a matter of learning how to read a pretty simple graph that kind of looks like an upside down Nike swoosh.
You think having those skills, though, and that experience with the gliders, do you think you learned anything that you could apply when you're flying the 182, or are they totally separate and one has nothing to do with the other?
Well, no. It's I did a video with Dan Milliken a while back in the hangar. This is a couple of years ago. He had called me and asked me if I'd ever had an engine out in flight. And fortunately, I've only had one, and it was in a tailwheel airplane, and it ended up really being a non-event. Other than a forced landing in a field, it ended up being a non-event. But I credit the glider training that I had for not panicking when that big fan in the beginning, the front of the engine, the front of the airplane, stopped turning. And it really was just concentrating. I've done this 100 times, 1,000 times before. In gliders, it's just a little bit different glide ratio. That's all. We still got to manage our speed and all of that, on the way down, because we got no choice. That's where we're going. So I would suggest anybody listening, if you really want to hone your pilot skills, even if you don't get a glider rating, go out and get a little bit of glider experience, because it'll give you a lot of confidence. You would be amazed at how you can truly put a glider down on a dime, and it's not that difficult to do, and the skills translate well to powered aircraft.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Pat. I really like that. There is some transfer of knowledge there. So the skills used in one place, or the insight gained, can be applied someplace else. And by the way, Ted McDavitt, we have viewer comments to review. Ted McDavitt says, glad Polly and I landed in time to catch the show. We're glad you landed in time to catch the show too. Of course, you could watch it on repeat, but there's nothing like live. That Pat Brown experience live is just that's not to be missed.
But there's a story behind that.
Of course there is.
The Paulie that he's referring to is one of my dear friends who's a terrific CFI, and Ted is another terrific old friend of mine. I took him through his private certificate, and on Sunday, weather permitting, I'm about to administer his instrument rating check ride in his beautiful A36 Bonanza.
Very nice.
So they've been training all week, getting ready for the big day on Sunday.
I think it's worth pointing out at this stage, and we've covered this in the past, but really a vast majority of our viewership are personal friends of Pat Brown. And of course, if you're viewing this at any time, anywhere, you automatically become an honorary friend of Pat Brown. The membership pin is in the mail. You'll have that shortly. Danny Carson asks, is hot air balloon an endorsement? And I've never studied this, Pat, but I'm pretty sure that's a rating that's attached
Yeah.
to a private or commercial certificate.
It's a check
A little
ride.
bit different than an endorsement because there is a practical test involved.
Yeah, it's a check ride. But if I'm not mistaken, and I have to tell you, I'm saying this out partly out of ignorance, but if I'm not mistaken, an appropriately rated commercial balloon pilot can administer a check ride for a balloon pilot candidate. I don't
I
believe
think that's correct. I think that's
you
true.
have an FAA designee do that for you. But it is a check ride.
Well, let's specify just for folks who might not be clear. An endorsement is something like your tail dragger, high performance, complex aircraft, where you literally just fly to proficiency with a CFI and you
Right.
get a logbook endorsement, and now you're qualified to do that. Whereas a rating, multi-engine, instrument, hot air balloon, that's actually something you have to complete specific tasks. There's an airman certification standard or a practical test standard for it, and there is a practical test. Neither one of them are so difficult that it's not worth pursuing, but there are different levels of participation. For instance, you talked about the tail dragger. I wanted to get a tail dragger sign up for years. I mean, years and years, and it just never worked out. I'd book time with a flight school, and then somebody would land that beautiful yellow cub in a field and hit a ditch and tear the gear off, and the airplane's not available. I solved this by eventually buying a Piper Cub. I just found a really good deal on one. I have a friend who's a CFI with a lot of tail dragger experience. He flies his T6s, and he used to own a Stearman. And he did the training with me. We kind of traded. We made a deal that I would give him guitar lessons and he would teach me to fly tailwheel. And the funny part about it for me, Pat, is he signed me off in 2.8 hours. And my first tail dragger takeoff and landing solo was not the most confident I've ever been in my life. There were no fatalities. There were no open flames. It all worked out. But, that's one of those endorsement things. We flew enough, and he's like, you're doing everything. I don't have to intervene. I'll sign you off. That's kind of an interesting process where you just get some time and show proficiency, and off you go.
Yeah, my first experience with tail wheel airplanes was in one that had heel brakes, and
Fun.
oh yeah, I hate heel brakes. Anyway, we went up to see my brother, and his wife lived in Denver at the time, and he is likewise a CFI and an ex-airline pilot, and he's younger than I am. I'm better looking. He's younger. But he said, "Hey, come on up, and I'll teach you how to fly the tailwheel airplane on the airport." So it's okay. So went up there, and we got in. This is a very long story. I'm not going to bore you with all of it, but suffice it to say that it wasn't pretty. After the third landing, somehow his heel got stuck in between the rudder pedal and the side of the airplane, and it ended up with us porpoising off the runway into a field that separated the main runway from a dirt strip or a grass strip where a glider was getting ready to launch, and people scattering like ants as they see us bouncing over towards them. We came to a stop in a cloud of dust and a hearty hi-oh silver. And we just sat there for a minute and said, let's just quit for the day.
Sometimes the better part of valor is saying it's time to go to the barn. We're done.
Yeah. Ted's asking a question about an endorsement suffice for flight. And Ted, it's a flight review, not a BFR. You know that. I taught you better.
Well, and it's a good question though, because when you get right down to it, don't overthink it. A flight review is a minimum 1 hour ground, 1 hour flight, educational experience. It doesn't have to be in something you're rated in. It's an educational experience. So you could be a dedicated Cessna 172 or PA 28 pilot and say, I want to go do some tail dragger training. and I'm going to go fly with somebody for a couple hours. And yeah, Pat, my opinion is that's going to count as a flight review because you've covered air work, you've covered pattern work, you've dealt with energy management, power settings, you've talked about regulations and all the things you have to do in a flight review. So it really is kind of a double bang for the buck. You complete the flight review you need, plus you had something really fun to fly and something new that you might find, hey, I like that. I'm going to do more of that.
Yeah, the key to something like that is making sure to have that conversation with the CFI up front and let them know that not only do you want to get your tailwheel endorsement or your high performance or whatever the case may be, but you want it to count for a flight review, because there are certain things that 6156 says that you have to do in terms of the ground stuff. And you could conceivably get that tailwheel endorsement without ever cracking a book, which really isn't the spirit or the letter of the flight review for that matter. So you want to make sure you cover that with your CFI. I want to make this a flight review so that you can do all the things you're supposed to do.
That's very true. I actually did my flight review. I think my last one I did in a Stearman.
Yeah.
And I had a conversation with the CFI, and I have no Stearman time. I've flown a Waco before. I've owned a tail dragger, never flown a Stearman, but I'd like to do a BFR. I'm sorry. I'd like to do my flight review in the Stearman. And sure enough, that's what we did. And we went up and did stalls, and we did the ground, and we did the flight. But because he knew what my goal was, it wasn't just flying it around and getting used to this airplane. We actually check all the boxes, but that kind of goes with what we're talking about. Endorsements can be upgrades, and that's one that we're all required to do. So I don't know about you, Pat, and I suspect you're the same as me, but I've done flight reviews in twins and singles, seaplanes, biplanes, tail draggers, tricycle gear. I actually try to make that an educational experience. I don't want to fly just the same thing I always do. I want to really learn something and have some fun for that experience. And I might open the door to something I never considered doing seriously and find out I like it. That was the case with seaplanes. I mean, I really fell in love with them.
Yeah, we talked about this, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, or maybe more, a month or two ago. Maybe somebody asked a question about, does a flight review in a twin count for your flight review in a single, or vice versa? I don't remember which now. And that question actually caught me a little bit off guard, and I had to go back and double check and make sure, but it does. So if you're rated in a glider and you do it, that's fine. If you're rated in a tail wheel or in a multi, that's fine. It counts. So it cross-pollinates. So not the case with your 3 takeoffs and landings to a full stop.
Yeah. Chris Ritchie has an interesting question about aircraft dispatcher, and that's a real thing. But he's asking, is the course abbreviated because he has a private pilot certificate and he's about to upgrade to a commercial? Pat, please disagree with me if you think I'm wrong. And I was once, so it's possible it could happen again. The course is the course. And while there are, for instance, the glider, if you've got a private certificate or if you've got a commercial certificate, there's a little bit of commonality there. So it's different than starting from scratch. But when you're enrolling in a course, generally the course is the course. And if there's an airman certification standard or a practical test standard, it'll lay out what the requirements are. Your thoughts, Mr. Brown?
No, I think you're absolutely right, Jamie. And I remember there was a time too. In fact, the only time I think I made a mistake was the time that I thought I was wrong and it turned out I wasn't. But
we're a pair.
Yeah, I'm telling you. But no, I think if I understand the question is if you have a private or commercial certificate, does any of that count towards aircraft dispatcher training? And I know zero about being an aircraft dispatcher, but I would imagine not. Those are probably entirely different skills and knowledge sets, but I don't know that for sure.
I would think there's some transfer though, because things like weight and balance, you learned that. Things like gathering weather information, you know how to do that. So you still have to complete the course. You still have to go through the process. But each time you learn something, it adds to your body of knowledge and it makes the next step easier because you already know some of the prerequisites. It's like going from algebra 101 to 210. It's not that I ever did that.
It looks like Connor has kind of a similar educational type question. Any idea how I can apply to be an air traffic controller? I would suggest go to the FAA website and look there. I would imagine that, or Google it, to be quite honest with you. There's an application process, you can be sure. And I would imagine there's some sort of an age requirement on the low side. I think they make you retire at 55 or something like that. But I think there's an age requirement on the low side. There are multiple places around the country that are private schools, private colleges. So Texas State Community College, Texas State Technical College in Waco, for example, is one. You can enroll in their ATC program up there and walk out with a degree in air traffic control, associate's degree in air traffic control, and go work at a control tower. There's a place in Atlanta, I believe, that is a similar thing. They train to FAA standards, and you could end up working for the FAA, or you could end up working for a contract tower. But you are a legitimate air traffic controller. And from those contract towers, for example, there is a pathway. I know that because I've got a couple of friends that have done it, to actually working for the FAA as opposed to working for a private contractor that operates a control tower. So I would just Google how to become an FAA controller, and I'm sure that you'll find plenty of information there, Connor.
Yeah, and here in Central Florida where I am, we're in the very early stages, but there is going to be an ATC school established for both physical towers and remote towers. That's a new technology that I think there's only one or two of them in America now. I think Leesburg, Virginia has one. But remote towers are going to be a thing where, we've got over 19,000 non-towered airports. They can't afford the $70 million to build a tower, but a remote tower is much less expensive, and that's a real thing. It's worth doing. And I'll tell you the unconventional advice I often give people. If you want to be an air traffic controller, consider calling the tower and invite somebody for coffee and say, hey, can we just go sit down and you can tell me what that job is really like and what the process is and what would you suggest I do to go down that path? That's true of almost any industry. But, if you want to be an airline pilot, a mechanic, air traffic control, whatever, ask somebody who does it, because most of us are very happy to tell you how we got where we are. And, it's not just me and Pat. Pilots talk.
There's also a military component to that too. You can get air traffic control experience. A dear friend of mine retired from the service, the Air Force. He had been an air traffic controller in Greenland, and he said it was a really busy tower. They had 2 operations a month. But yes, a month. But he was an air traffic controller in Greenland, and that's where he got his training. He retired, and he did not continue on that career. But the point is, there is a military element there.
Hey, folks, if you would do me a favor, if those of you watching, if you have any add-on at all, whether it's an endorsement or a rating, if there's anything you've upgraded after getting your private certificate, just put me in the comments. I'd be really curious to find out how many of us have done that. Good podcast called Opposing Bases of 2 ATC controllers who are pilots talk about their experiences. Thank you, Agram Leedy. That's a great one. And yeah, some pilots are ATC controllers. Some ATC controllers are pilots. Not all. Most pilots are not ATC. Most ATC people are not pilots. So if you can get somebody that's got both skill sets, awesome. And Pat, now I would like to segue into another thought process on the endorsements and upgrades. It might actually save you money in the long run, because insurance rates for aircraft owners, pilots, whatever, are based on experience levels and certifications. So the more education you have, the more ratings and certificates you have, the more hours you build safely over that is probably going to be reflected in your insurance rates over the long term. So it actually might be cost effective to add something that you think is fun, but will lower your rates over the long haul. Agree or disagree? Let's point counterpoint. You call me names. Go ahead.
All right. I can't repeat what I was going to call you. So, by the way, that Opposing Bases is a really good podcast. If you haven't heard it, Jamie, you should check into it. It's really a good podcast. Particularly the instrument rating. I've got I know firsthand of several pilots that were kind of in the mid 200-hour range or something like that, and got a hankering for a Cirrus in a partnership, and a couple of different partnerships. but again, neither one of them were instrument rated. Well, they got insurance, and wasn't particularly a problem getting the insurance, but the premium was sky high relative to what the partnership had been paying prior to the non-instrument rated pilot. Now, in one particular case, the insurance company agreed to leave the premium alone for, I think it was 3 or 4 months, but the new partner had to agree to get his instrument rating within that period of time, or the premium would go up. The other case that I remember, they weren't willing to do anything like that. They just simply hit them with a premium that was $1,000 or $2,000 higher than they'd been paying. Of course, the new partner paid the delta, and then the following year, after he'd gotten his instrument rating, the insurance came back down, not quite to the original rate, because he was still a fairly low time pilot, even with the instrument rating, but it came down dramatically from what it had been before he got his instrument rating. That is an absolute true statement. I don't know how much a multi-engine or seaplane or glider or high performance. I don't know how much that will help. It certainly won't hurt, but that instrument rating for sure.
Oh yeah, that absolutely makes a difference. And it's kind of like having the complex endorsement to some degree. They know you've dealt with GUMPS checks and things like that. You've got some regimented method to your flying, and that does help you. And that's the whole thing with the instrument. You're going to get into fewer conditions that are going to be a problem that you can't recover from, causing them to pay out. Pat,
our insurance
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Last year, our insurance on our Comanche actually went down $500. I have not heard of anybody's insurance going down in the last several years. Most of them went up. We double checked with our broker to make sure that this is not a mistake, and he assured us it wasn't. So we paid that just like that. We paid that to bind it. But this year, it went up. It did go up. It went up $100. But in airplane money, that's 1/10 of an AMU. I mean, that's nothing.
Yeah, and you're going up at a slower rate than somebody else might be, just because of that.
Part of that is because my partner he broke 1,000 hours 2 years ago. Most of that is in the Comanche, and flies about 200 hours a year. And I fly on the average about 600 hours a year. And so I suspect that those were probably mitigating factors for why it went down.
Oh, sure. Proficiency really counts. By the way, Chris Ritchie has an interesting question about ground instructors. If you want to take the fundamentals of instruction and get a basic ground instructor or an instrument ground instructor, advanced instrument ground instructor, those are all just written tests. You take the knowledge test and mail off your results, and they just send you the certificate. Now, I'm old enough, Pat, that when I did that, you could actually walk into the FSDO and show them your test results, and they would just give you your temporary certificate. It's a little less touchy-feely now, but it's just knowledge tests, and boom, you have the ability to monetize your education now and teach.
Yeah, if you are a state licensed teacher, then you don't have to take the fundamentals of instruction test because you're a state licensed teacher. If you're not, then you have to take the fundamentals of instruction test. And there's no way to sugarcoat this one. It's 50 questions, and you just got to slog through the manual and learn the stuff and take the test. Not difficult. It's just, you just got to mindset. It's just got to be, it's not the most compelling reading. And so you just have to make your mind, just accept that. And then either the advanced or the instrument ground or whatever you decide to do, that is, I think that's 60 questions. It's been so long since I've taken one of those. And then once you get those test results, you go into IACRA and you fill out the appropriate paperwork, and you contact a designated examiner who can meet you someplace at your leisure and his or her leisure. And it's about a 10-minute process to verify who you are and that you have the appropriate identification, documentation, and such, and you'll walk out of there with your temporary ground instructor certificate. And by the way, you'll get a second green card when that doesn't get attached to your pilot certificate. It's a separate card.
That's right. And just for clarity, IACRA is because we don't actually do the paper 8710s and send them in anymore. You're allowed to, but they really hate it. So the online version is IACRA, IACRA. And basic ground instructor allows you to instruct sport and private pilot applicants, and advanced lets you teach commercial applicants. But it's worth doing. I got one years ago. I think it was absolutely worth it. Pat, I assume you've got an advanced ground instructor.
Actually, I went straight to the instrument. Because you can really teach anything with a ground instructor certificate. If you have an instrument, you can certainly teach basic or advanced. It's just ground. I mean, even without a ground instructor certificate, flight instructors are expected to teach ground. The difference is that you're signing off with your CFI, not your AGI or IGI or what have you. But it's really, from a practical standpoint, it's the same thing. For a flight instructor, the benefit of having a ground instructor certificate is that you have to have one of those in order to get your gold seal. And the gold seal is basically 10 sign-offs in a 2-year period with an 80% first-time pass rate. But you can't do that without having a ground instructor certificate tied to it. So that was my motivation in getting the ground instructor certificate, is because there was 1 year I had, I think, 23 sign-offs and about a 90% first-time pass rate. And I didn't know if I was going to get anywhere near that in subsequent years. So I wanted to get that gold seal added, because once you get it, it never falls off.
Yeah, it's a great one to have. Let's talk a little bit about seaplanes, because you and I love them, and how that works as an add-on, because a seaplane is a rating. You can add on a private seaplane or a commercial seaplane, but there's no knowledge test. In that sense, it's almost like the tail dragger, but there is a practical test where the tail dragger is just an endorsement. You train to proficiency. Similar thing with the seaplane. You train to proficiency, and you then go take a check ride with an examiner. But Pat, it's a little different if you're a sport pilot, isn't it?
Well, it can be a little different if you're a sport pilot. Let's just say that you are a glider pilot. Maybe you're a private glider pilot, and gliders, if they're under 1,320 pounds and under 100 and I'm drawing a blank on the speed at this point. 100, I think it's 120 knots. But if they fall, if their speed and weight allow them to fall in the classification of a light sport, and you're let's say you're a private glider pilot but no power time, you could actually go to flight school that flies light sport aircraft, powered aircraft, and train to proficiency with a CFI. And then this does have to be done on paper as far as an 8710 goes. Fill out the appropriate paperwork application, and then you would take a check ride, but not with an FAA person. You'd actually take a check ride with just another flight instructor who essentially says, yep, this person's good to go flying powered aircraft under light sport rules, flying light sport aircraft. And that's a logbook endorsement. It's a logbook endorsement by your initial instructor, and it's a logbook endorsement by the check airman, if you want to call him that. And then the paperwork is submitted, and you'll get another certificate back in the mail that has an airplane attached to your a light sport airplane attached to your private pilot glider. And the same thing with powered lift or any of the aircraft, any of the aircraft that fall into the light sport category. You can go back and forth with just proficiency rides, whether it's powered lift or I'm sorry, wake shift or powered parachute or glider or airplane or whatever falls in. And I think there's even a lighter than air. And I think if you hold a light sport for one, you can hopscotch between them as long as you do these proficiency rides. So it's a little simpler process. It is a check ride, to be sure, but not with the Fed. and it's really more of a check airman coming in and confirming that you're proficient. So it's to proficiency, like you mentioned on the seaplane thing, Jamie.
Now, you've touched on a word that is near and dear to my heart, and I think we got to talk about it as long as we're talking about endorsements and add-ons, and that's proficiency. If you haven't flown in 6 or 8 years, and that happens to a lot of us at some point in our lives, a new add-on is not going to be the easiest thing in the world, because that's adding on. It's additional to what you've normally done. You're probably better off just going through like the AOPA Rusty Pilot program, get with a flight instructor and fly something you're used to flying. Even if it's been a while, get up to speed, then go for the add-on. And Pat, I'm curious on your perspective on this, because one of the things I do see when people try and add on something, but they're not proficient, it's a real struggle. Whereas if they go back to what they started and get their flight review in that, get a few hours to get comfortable, and then shift over to adding that tail dragger, the seaplane, whatever it is they want to add, that's a much more enjoyable process, and it works. They struggle less. Is that your experience or opinion as well?
Yeah, honestly, Jamie, as you were talking there, I was trying to remember back if I had ever really experienced a situation where somebody came back from maybe some years off of flying and wanted to go straight into a tail wheel or something along those lines. I can't recall that ever having been the case. So I will defer to your immense experience and simply agree with your opinion, because it makes perfect sense that you're already stretching those those mental corpuscles up there when you're trying to get back to something you hadn't done for a while. And if you add on top of that, adding something entirely new to something you haven't done for a while, I mean, it makes perfect sense that it would be a struggle.
Well, thank you very much for being gracious with me, Pat. I feel validated and good. And I want to come to Ingram Leedy with his remote pilot thing in just a minute. But let's talk about one of the big bugaboos in any aspect of flight training, and that's cost. And cost is a function of time invested, because everything is billed on an hourly basis. I think it's a mistake to look at something and say, oh, adding this takes 5 hours of training. Adding that takes 8 hours of training. That's a target. That's not going to be your experience or my experience. As I said, I got my tail dragger sign off in 2.8 hours, and I was very pleased to do that. It might take somebody else 5. It might take somebody else 10. And it doesn't matter. It might take somebody else 2.7, and they did better. But if you get in your head, this is going to take 5 hours, and it doesn't take 5 hours, you're disappointed, or maybe you feel like you're being overcharged. That's not the case. It's about proficiency, isn't it, Pat? It's about the ability to truly act as PIC in that new realm and not require intervention by the instructor or the examiner.
Yeah, I think my tail wheel training, if I remember right, in fact, when we got back to Houston after the ill-fated Denver trip, I sought out someone who specializes in teaching tail wheels. Her name is Joy Bowden, and she's I don't know, she's in her early 80s now, but she still flies Stearman and teaches tail wheel. But one of the best flight instructors I've ever flown with ever. And I think it was about 6 hours before I, first of all, got over the fear of tail wheel airplanes after my previous experience. But I think it was about 6 hours. And on my seaplane rating, it was probably about 8 before I probably could have passed a check ride at 5, but I didn't feel comfortable with that, and I didn't want the extra pressure. And so I just said, I want to fly for another couple of hours and go through a couple of mock check rides and, make sure that I can fly this thing without you, it's Mr. Instructor, having to say a word to me, other than maybe telling me what you wanted me to do, but not how to do it, and just make sure I would kill us. And so what really concerns me, Jamie, and this brings up, I mean, this is really a bigger issue, and that is just any flight school that says we guarantee X, Y, and Z in X number of hours. Man,
I'm
I
with you. I question that because I guarantee we both have a fair amount of experience. If we both pick the same new thing to try, we're not going to finish in the same amount of time.
probably not.
That's just not going to happen because we have slightly different experiences. We learn at different rates. You're way better looking. I'm somewhat smarter. We would finish at a different rate. Having that expectation that, oh, this is just going to work out this way, that's
Yeah.
not true. And I had the same thing. When I started with the multi-private so I could log PIC time on my way to my multi-commercial because I knew I was going to do that. And when we hit 5 hours, my instructor said he was going to sign me off for the ride. And I said, I want another flight. And it's like, well, it's a multi. It's kind of expensive. I know I'm doing it, but I'm not confident I'm doing it. I need another flight. And that's just me. I want to go into that check ride confident, not like, I'm pretty sure I'll do it, because check rides aren't cheap either. And I want to succeed. So yeah, there's nothing wrong with just taking that attitude and saying, it's not the hour requirement. I want the instructor to think I'm proficient. And as you said, I want to get through that instructional flight with no input, no need for input. Nobody has to intervene. Now I'm ready to go take that ride.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's almost like being penny wise and pound foolish. You may be able to get through that check ride, but if you don't, then you've got a bust on your record. The instructor's got a bust on his or her record. It's going to cost you another $400, $500, $600, $700 for the check ride when you could have spent another couple of $100 maybe for one more flight. I mean, it's just like I said, penny wise and pound foolish to push that too much.
Yeah, and there is no shame in having another hour of dual in your logbook. I mean,
No.
I have a lot of dual. I'm sure you do too, because we've done so many different things, and you keep going into something you're not rated for, or just, whatever it is. Having that dual, that just means I'm seeking an education. I'm trying to get better. That's not a negative.
Yeah. And it's funny. I remember, I don't know really what prompted this memory, but I remember that I was flying with a student in a motor glider, and this particular student had a private pilot glider certificate on all of his other ratings, had lots of other ratings, and but he wanted to get his commercial glider certificate instead of just his private, and so I was flying with him and doing my best to impart, my knowledge and wisdom. But for me as a CFI, watching him trim the airplane was an education just for me. I'm giving the dual, but I'm getting just as much as I'm giving, just watching him in the art of trimming that airplane. And I didn't mention the fact that he was about 89 years old when I was flying with him and flew B-24s in World War II. So, and here I am. I've just got a few thousand hours under my belt at the time. Actually, it's probably more like 7 or 8 years ago. A few thousand hours under my belt, and I'm here and I'm just watching this guy. And then a couple of years later, he repaid the favor and checked me out in the Baron. By that time, he was about 90, 92 or something like that. And he kicked my ass in that Baron. I got to tell you, he could hardly get up in the airplane, but he kicked my ass in that airplane. He showed me what flying was all about. So
that is awesome. And it doesn't have to be a complex airplane. There used to be a guy down here who's gone now, unfortunately, but Jim Torpy flew at the seaplane base. There's actually at the seaplane base, there's a picture of a space shuttle, and it's endorsed to Jim. And they emailed down to the base once from the space shuttle because Jim got the pilot his private ticket years ago.
Oh,
so,
man.
I mean, you could be flying with a guy in a T-Craft or a Cub or a Champ, some very basic machine, and they're just the best they could possibly be. And if you can have that experience and not learn from them, you're smarter than me, because I pick something up every time. Yeah. Let's address Ingram Leedy's remote pilot thing, because remote pilot for drones, that's becoming a bigger and bigger thing, and it is an add-on It's a different certificate. It's a separate certificate. But if you are a private pilot or a commercial pilot, it's just a written test you take online. It's a very, very simple process. Now, it's a different process if you're not a pilot, but we're talking about add-ons. So if you are a pilot, adding on that drone is a really simple process. And Pat, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that enables you to earn money as a drone pilot.
Yeah, that's you're operating under Part 107 at that point, and it's a written test. If you're a certificated pilot, it's a written test. And it's for a DPE, it's an administrative function. So if you present yourself after the appropriate paperwork, I mean, there's always paperwork, but if you present yourself to me with the certificate of graduation and all of that kind of stuff, it's about a 4, 5, 6 minute process in IACRA to get your remote pilot certificate. Yeah.
I think it's the coolest thing. The diversity of opportunity we have, from helicopters, seaplanes, gliders, skis, multi-engine, instrument, all this stuff. If you fly, you've got to be able to find something that appeals to you, something that say, yeah, I'd like to add that. And it's just got such benefit for you. At the very worst, as Pat said at the beginning, is you're going to have a heck of a lot of fun, because you just cannot fly and get better without having some fun. Would you agree with me, Mr. Brown?
I would agree with you 110%, Mr. Beckett. You are spot on as usual.
I love it when I'm right. Hey, are you comfortable talking about this? We actually hadn't talked about it before because, as you know, audience, every word we say is scripted, every single one. But since this is the last episode of the year, I'm going to depart from that. One of the things Pat and I are very proud of, as is Kay, who's off tonight, and all our best to Kay out in California. Rusty Pilot presentation has been so successful as a seminar in a live setting, as a webinar. We get a vast variety of people. I believe it's over 11,000 pilots now, Pat, are current again, because unlike when you and I were rusty years ago, there actually is a process now to bring you back, make it easy. You can register. If you're an AOPA member, it's free. You can go to as many of them as you want. But there's an offshoot of that now called Back to Your Roots. Are you willing to talk about that a little bit in a public setting?
No.
Okay.
Show's over. Sorry. We got 7 minutes, but show's over. No, back to your roots. And if we have any airline pilots or really Part 135 pilots or anybody that flies professionally in bigger stuff, we identified several years ago that there was a population of airline type pilots that hadn't flown GA in, who knows, 5, 10, 20, 30 years, maybe something like that, or they're retiring and want to start flying little airplanes again, but not knowing where to start. And so we came up with the idea of Back to Your Roots, and we did a beta presentation probably 5 years ago or so, and then we got busy with some other projects, and during COVID we dusted that back off again, and it's going to end up, it's in two forms. When it's finally completed, it's going to be in two forms. One is kind of a self-guided online thing, kind of like Rusty Pilot has an online version. And then there's also a live webinar, and we did one of those back 2 or 3 months ago. It's kind of our inaugural one. We've got another one coming up, I think in March of 2023. So anybody that's listening, if you have any airline pilot buddies, airline buddies that have been thinking about getting back into general aviation, this is a really, really good webinar. We kind of take it like, what are the things that you have to do that like your dispatcher does for you, like figure out the weight and balance and the fuel that you've got to take and all those kind of things. And by the way, don't you remember you got to do a passenger briefing, because your flight attendants do that for you now. And we talk a little bit about GPS approaches, because there's a little difference between that and in the airline world. We talk about ADS-B and we fly a make believe trip because we want to cover class B, C, D, E, and G airspace. Because if you're flying an IFR all the time, instrument flight plan all the time, it doesn't matter what airspace you're flying and you're cleared through it. Not so much the case when you're flying general aviation necessarily. So Back to Your Roots has been a lot of fun to put together, and it's been done in conjunction with several of my airline pilot friends who have been gracious enough to sit through a whole bunch of beta presentations via Zoom and correct me when I said something stupid, which is quite frequent actually. And so it's turned out to be a pretty good presentation, and we're going to start doing it on a regular basis in 2023. So I think that killed about 3.5 minutes, Jamie.
Well, I love that. And Donnie, if you wouldn't mind, I'm talking to Donnie McKay, our producer, who, as you know, is hunkered down in a hardened bunker at the base of Mount Rushmore. But can you put up that picture of Katie and Buck, if you would, Donnie? Because, we've talked about all these add-ons and things like that. That's the great and powerful Katie Pribble, who I have a small little altar to at my home, because her genius was expressed by her being fundamental in hiring both myself and Pat Brown to work for AOPA and do what we do right now. That's her airplane, Buck. Katie grew up on a cattle ranch. She does not come from a flying family. She flew for the airlines at a time. She's just an absolutely remarkable woman. But look at that smile on her face, and she flies Buck in and out of the grass strip at her house. You've got to be able to go get some training to do the things you want to do. Thank you, Donnie. And it doesn't matter if you're going to be flying a T-Craft, or if you're going to be flying a Stearman, or you're going to be flying an AN-2, big Soviet era round engine biplane tail dragger. You can do anything. And the thing I love about Back to the Roots, Pat, Back to Your Roots, and I did teach it years ago when we were first doing that beta at Women in Aviation in Orlando one year. And it was great because we had military pilots and commercial pilots who you would think these are very proficient, highly trained people, and they are. But as Pat says, they don't have a clue what Gulf airspace is or how to deal with a non-towered airport, because that's not what I do. It doesn't matter if your full experience is 100 hours in a Cessna 150, or if you're a 777 captain with 35 years of experience. There's still something you haven't done. There's still something new to try. And there's somebody out there who can teach you to do it. And they might be 19 years old and wear weird clothes and have a bunch of tattoos, or they might look like Pat and I. But
God forbid.
The great thing is, really, whatever you want to do in aviation, it's out there. Doesn't matter what your experience level it is. Doesn't matter what your goals are. There's a path to get there. And that's, frankly, Pat, that is what I have loved about this. And when I started in this business, I had no idea. I certainly didn't know I'd be doing all these different things and having all this much fun. And just being able to sit around in the hangar with a cup of coffee on a rainy day, talking to a bunch of other people who have done the same kind of things, and we all have stories. That's a life, man. That really is.
I hear you, buddy. I feel exactly the same way. We are blessed.
Well, let's meet back here. I think we talked about giving everybody the Christmas holiday off, if I'm not mistaken, because we are kind-hearted, family-oriented people, Pat. We had that discussion. Let's meet right back here on Tuesday, January 10th, 2023. Make sure you change the date on your checks. You don't want to be the person that makes that mistake. And we'll start a whole new cornucopia of general aviation awesomeness with the fantabulous Pat Brown, Kay Sundrum, who will come back all spiffy and new and just looking great. And maybe I'll come back too. But if you can, find your way out to Buckeye, Arizona, February 17th to 19th, and I will actually sign your shirt or whatever you want, because it's time to go out west. I was born in Phoenix. I love the desert Southwest. It is time to go home, Pat.
Oh, sayonara.
Thanks so much. Special thanks to Donnie McKay, who really does a great job putting this together. If you want to know more about any of this, you can write Pat and I and Kay at ambassadors at AOPA.com. Please do me a favor and click the like on this program because it means the world to us. And if you're really an advanced viewer, and I think a couple of you are, share the link on your social media pages because then you never know. You might get a Christmas card from us next year. It could happen. Pat, any parting words?
Nope, I'm talked out.
Thanks a lot, y'all. I do appreciate it. Pat, you have a Merry Christmas. It's always good to see you, buddy, in person or through the interwebs. I'll catch you up to you next time, January 10th.
Merry Christmas, my friend. I see you.